I voted for you as my representative, and thereby you must benefit me personally and my family. You must either give me cash outright or at least some sort of material assistance, right? And for politicians to succeed in this sort of environment, well, you need to hand out cash. This is not even, I'm not even talking about vote buying. It's simply your voters coming to you and say, I need cash, otherwise I cannot survive, right? I mean, even if you're ministers and even you're cleaners of the cleaners, how are you going to give out all this cash, right? I mean, you can say, oh yeah, use government resources. There's also very limited government resources, right? So, well, sometimes you would need to you need to say, oh, okay, sorry, I don't have that kind of cash, but my friend businessman one, he could probably give you a job or something like that. Then businessman one and you probably will have some kind of arrangement. You will get some projects in order for him to create those jobs, right? Yeah. So I'm not trying at all to justify this sort of what I would call collusion. Perhaps not exactly corruption, but collusion, right? But that's reality in not only Malaysia, not only Sabah, but in Kenya, in Ghana, in Rwanda, and so on. So it's a very common phenomenon in developing countries.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Kopitiam Council with Adi and Hafiz. Today we have another esteemed guest here with us today that's going to be talking something that we always like to do, which is current affairs, both international and local. But like the last episode, we're going to be using something different this time because we are in a new paradigm, a paradigm that our Prime Minister is very confident and very he emphasizes a lot whenever
also
he goes
his initials.
And ironically, it's his initials, which is AI. So what I've done is ask our good friend ChatGPT to give us a bio of our guest today. So if we get anything wrong, then that can be corrected. So without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. O.A. Sun, a prominent political analyst and senior fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. With his extensive expertise in Malaysian politics, international relations, and governance, Dr. O has become a trusted voice in Southeast Asian affairs. He has contributed to numerous publications and media outlets, offering keen insights and thought-provoking analysis. So if any of you are also glued to your television screen, you would know that Dr. O, he is also quite prominent on Channel News Asia, where he gives all his breakdowns on international politics or even local. So, Dr. O, before we start, we would just want to break it down for our viewers, just to get to know you a bit better. What got you interested in this field of study or into analyzing international politics?
Well, first of all, I think the AI did a very flattering portrayal of myself. So much so, I don't know whether I could live up to that. I think since a very young age, I have been very interested in current affairs in general, but international relations, international affairs in particular. I still remember some of my parents' friends, when I met them as an adult. They told me when they visited my house when I was very young, I probably was in kindergarten, and they saw me flipping newspapers, even at that very tender age. So I always had an interest on what's happening around us, what's happening in society, and by extension, then what happens in politics. And sometimes the politics of one country, it's perhaps also influenced by what's the current trends going on around the world. So that's what got me interested in all this international affairs and politics.
Okay, so I think you can just dive in.
All right, so let's get straight to the matter. Let's start off something that anticipated very heavily, which is Malaysia assuming the chairmanship of ASEAN next year, 2025. What should be the top priority as the host nation?
Well, I think Malaysia's declare priorities would be, for example, sustainability and inclusivity. But if you look at this sort of very, frankly speaking, broad ideas, underlying them, oh, it's still the economy. Huh? I think even though the pandemic, it's like 3 or 4 years behind us, well, 2 years behind us, but still, I think a lot of Southeast Asian countries are still reeling from the adverse effects of the pandemic. We are still trying to in a sense, recover, going back at least to the level of economic development that we enjoyed before the pandemic. So I think if Malaysia were to be able to play a more proactive role in this regard, because Malaysia is one of the major economies in Southeast Asia, how could we, for example, when you talk about inclusivity, right? How can we include more of those countries which join ASEAN later, the Cambodias, the Laos, and even Myanmar and so on? How could we make sure that as the rest of Southeast Asia is recovering, that these countries are also being included as we progress forward? I think if we view inclusivity in that regard, then it will be very meaningful. Then, of course, within every country, every ASEAN country, there are different stratas of societies, right? In Malaysia, we will call them the so-called B40, the M40. And now we have this category called the T15. I wonder why it's not 20, but it's 15. But I think other countries in Southeast Asia, there's similar categorizations. How do we make sure that, for example, the B40 or the B30, they are also enjoying the fruits of economic development across the board? I think that is also what we mean by inclusivity here.
All right, picking up on when it comes to reeling from current trends, like trends that have happened, I think one of the things is that we're still reeling even from events that are happening now with the ongoing situation in Ukraine, changes in leadership, having the most elections within this year. So I want to go with global here, Doctor. So we've seen a shake-up in global leadership in the past few months. The UK now having Keir Starmer, Argentina having a weird episode with Javier Milei, and obviously Donald Trump returning to the White House. What is your outlook on the current state of international affairs?
Well, of course, I think Donald Trump is at the back of everybody's mind, especially those of us who are commentators on international developments and affairs. I think we are very ironically going to see perhaps a more or at least hopefully a more stable international outlook for the next few years. Now, Donald Trump, of course, is a so-called disruptor. He has many different ideas as to how to run America and many different ideas as to how the world should proceed. But I think he's not somebody who is really out there to look for a war. If anything, he has vowed to end some of these ongoing wars, such as those in Ukraine and also in the Middle East. So I think over the next few years, as America looks inward, I think we are going to see economically, we might be quite adversely impacted, because many Southeast Asian economies, such as Malaysia, such as Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam, and Singapore, and so on, we depend a lot on our economic interactions with the United States. And if the United States under Donald Trump, at least the economic sector, is looking inward, then it's very difficult for us to, for example, sell things to the US, then our economy will be impacted. But conversely speaking, I think Donald Trump is not very keen in, for example, this whole idea of building alliances to encircle China and so on. I mean, he doesn't like the idea that China has trade deficits against U.S. Namely, China the trade deficit is in favor of China, but his focus on China is very economically oriented. I don't think he cares so much about the differences in ideology between China and U.S. and thereby this constant pressure for Southeast Asian countries to so-called choose side, whether you're with the US or whether you're with China and so on. I think that kind of pressure would be lessened. Economically, not so good. In terms of geopolitics, I think it's looking up. Yeah.
All right, because you mentioned about US, I think we cannot mention US alone without China, right? So regarding Malaysia-China relationship, when it comes to trade, Malaysia is very adamant. We see Anwar Ibrahim and the king himself went to China. Anwar a couple of times already in the space of within 2 years. And but when it comes to Southeast Asia, South China Sea, Anwar seems to be very sort of like delaying and also using ASEAN as a conduit to respond to China. Is this gonna work in the long run?
It's not gonna, shall we say, reach a final resolution. But we have to go along as we act along. I mean, because as you strongly implied, economically, we are also very dependent upon China. China is our largest trading partner, right? So when you are so economically dependent upon China, it's very difficult to be very gung-ho, to be very antagonistic against China, even on issues such as the South China Sea sovereignty disputes. I think since many, many years ago, and this cuts across many premierships. I mean, from, let's say, Dr. Mahathir's first term to Abdullah Badawi, Najib, and then, there are a whole slew of prime ministers. I think they basically have the same approach, namely, when there are some run-ins with China on South China Seas, typically we are rather so-called reticent about that. We don't widely publicize it like, for example, Philippines does. We try to negotiate with them. We will launch protests, but quietly and behind the scene and so on. Only when it is really egregious, really like huge ship ramming into some of our ships and so on, then perhaps we will sort of disclose that, oh yeah, we did launch a protest with China and so on. And that's been pragmatic, to be blunt about it. Do we like to keep such a low profile? I don't think so. But, the economy is heavily dependent upon China. So what can we do? And of course, the prime ministers and, as you say, even the king, we visited China and tried to promote investments from China into Malaysia and so on.
Okay, when talking about the international engagements Malaysia has always made over the years, there's always this crystallized idea where engagements are dichotomous, which is always oriented between China and the US. But sometimes there's also a third axis that colors some administrations. For Mahathir was the Look East policy and becoming a champion of the developing world. And I think this time around with Dr. Anwar Ibrahim is that there is this hyper focus on the Middle East. So a tremendous amount of effort, diplomatic effort, has been made on Putrajaya regarding the ongoing genocide and atrocities happening in Palestine and Lebanon, committed by the Zionist state. So this has placed Malaysia on somewhat of a renewed front, right, towards securing leadership throughout the Islamic world. So is there any chance that Malaysia can play a pivotal role in, potential peace talks or even facilitation towards a cessation of violence or even long-term stability, even with the consideration that Malaysia does not officially recognize the state of Israel? What do you think of this, Doctor?
Well, a country's foreign policy it's very often colored by economic concerns on the one hand, and also, shall we say, ideological outlook, right? This focus on, let's say, China and Malaysia's foreign policy is actually a rather recent phenomenon, and that's because, China became economically very prominent over the last, let's say, 1 or 2 decades, right? And correspondingly, because our economic interaction with China, it's very frequent and it's large volume, and therefore, we have to, in a sense, been very close with China. But as you mentioned also previously, when Japan and Korea, they were investing heavily in Malaysia, we also had look east policy, right? We also became very close to them because, they are big economic partners, right? And the US, it's always there. I mean, the US investments is not the biggest, but it's always there. So we also, in a sense, maintain, shall we say, somewhat stable relations with the United States. So economic concern, it's one, and your foreign policy will adjust accordingly. The other one is, of course, ideological outlook, right? Malaysia, it's a Muslim majority nation, and therefore, matters which pertains to Islam, matters which pertains to religion, typically would also color Malaysia's foreign policy. And this is most prominently displayed in Malaysia's not having a diplomatic relations with Israel, and it's very often championing the Palestinian cause in the international stage. Now, but things could evolve very differently sometimes. That's why I talk about the trends in international affairs. I hesitate to call them mega trends because I don't know whether that's patented. but let's say they are trends, right? Economically, for example, you see now, even though China is still developing very fast, not as fast as before with double-digit growth, but still it's at 5% and so on. But there are also signs of Chinese economy slowing down, right? So if China's interactions with us economically is no longer that strong, but our interactions with some other economies, it's getting more frequent and with larger volumes, then perhaps our attention, our foreign policy attention will very naturally train to that particular nation or even a region. Let's say it's the EU, for example, or if Trump wants to make America great again, but not necessarily interacting a lot with foreign countries, right? So now, ideologically, in terms of let's say Malaysia potentially playing some role in, shall we say, moderating the Middle East conflict and so on, perhaps not in the short run. There are actually a lot of undercurrents going on in the Middle East. For example, Israel's conflict with Hamas and with Hezbollah and so on. A lot of media focus were, of course, on all these shall we say, atrocities being committed. But I think some Arab countries are not necessarily unhappy to see Hamas and Hezbollah being totally destroyed. And I would even name, the most prominent Arab country, namely Saudi Arabia, for example, or even Egypt. I don't think they are not happy to see Hamas gone, totally gone, and Hezbollah to accompany them as well. So, and if you remember last October of last year, before Hamas incursion into Israel proper, Israel and Saudi Arabia, they were already very close to establishing formal diplomatic relations. I remember Bibi talking about an axis of prosperity or something all the way from Saudi to Europe and so on, right? And I think that's still going on. Despite what Israel has been doing in the battlefields, I think that's still going on. And I think at some point, in a very not so distant future, Israel and Saudi Arabia, they will establish formal diplomatic relations. Already Israel with a number of Gulf countries, right? So, and if that happens, because Saudi Arabia had, shall we say, a rather commanding code within the international Islamic community. So I think many other countries will follow suit. The Pakistans, the Indonesias. Indonesia already has informal relations with Israel. I think there's some sort of Israeli trade office in Jakarta, if I remember correctly. So, and Malaysia, being also a Muslim majority country, I think will also follow suit. So I think events will overtake this. While we are not so happy to view all these atrocities, but to be blunt about it, international relations, international affairs sometimes can be quite brutal. A lot of undercurrents going on in the Middle East, and those undercurrents, some are positive ones, like this rapprochement between, let's say, Israel with, let's say, Saudi Arabia. Israel already has formal diplomatic relations with Egypt and with I think Turkey recently cut it or something like that, or vowed to cut that sort of ties. But again, when you have common interests, when you have common enemies, sometimes you walk together. That's just the way it is around the world.
Yeah, perhaps this is maybe the last question about international relations. Not for the entire episode, just international relations. And recently, you cannot mention Malaysia without BRICS as well. It becomes a trend as well. Like it becomes a buzzword. What is the number one thing Malaysia looking for out of BRICS?
To be very blunt about it, I think it's to make China even happier. Because
China.
Yeah, BRICS, it's primarily supposed to be an economic setup, right? I mean, economic cooperation and so on. And because within the BRICS family, China is the leading economy, much larger than any other economy within the BRICS family.
Correct.
Therefore, it is leading BRICS. And Malaysia will, of course, would like to ingratiate itself further with China, with the hope that, just like with the Belt and Road initiatives, they have some infrastructure projects here. Well, hopefully under BRICS, they also has some other projects which we could benefit from. Because if you look at, frankly speaking, if you look at other benefits of, let's say, interacting with other BRICS nations, they are, shall we say, very politely, not very strong economies, right? I mean, interacting with Russia's economy, it's about the size of the Guangdong province in China only. With, let's say, Brazil, I don't know what we can do together. So, and also within BRICS, you see, for example, China and India, they are definitely not real friends. They might be friends on the surface, but not real friends, right? So BRICS, number one, has a lot of internal conflicts that it has to resolve. And number two, with the exception of China, the other economies within BRICS are really not doing particularly well. So I could only imagine is so that we could, avail ourselves of more investment from China.
Yeah, so that means our orientation towards BRICS is still quite Beijing-centric.
I think so, and that's by necessity. If the United States, it's not likely over the next 4 years under Trump, right? But let's say in an alternative universe, the US, it's really going out there having their own versions of Belt and Roads and so on, and investing heavily in Malaysia in not just, let's say, one or two industries, but in many industries, well, then we will accordingly reorientate our foreign policy to be more in favor of the US.
Okay, so I think we've already covered some international bases here. Let's go back to domestic situation with Malaysia. So this is something that came out fresh off the news. So Versi published their report and gave the Madani government a D grade, an improvement from F last year. Ismail Sabri scored the highest point of 5 and Anwar only at 3 points. What do you you think about this sentiment published? Is it grounded in a kind of reality, or is it really just?
Well, BRCE, by definition, it's about clean elections and so on. Therefore, of course, it focuses on, let's say, reforms and reform-related initiatives, whether they are being properly tabled and promoted and adopted and so on. And if you solely judge from those criteria, then during the Ismail Sabri's administration, short that in May, he did, enact a number of those, shall we say, reform-oriented policies, right? Such as, if I remember correctly, anti-hopping law was adopted during his terms, and then he reached out to the opposition to support them with MOU and so on. These are rather innovative, reform-oriented initiatives. So BRCE accordingly gave him a very high score, right? Even higher than, let's say, Najib, whom some said also had some reform initiatives. This current government, frankly speaking, even though it is, or at least the PH part of it, but the Pakatan Harapan part of it, they were elected at the back of expectations, right? That they are going to really push through a lot of reforms after they are in power and so on. But of course, now that they are in power for, I think, exactly 2 years, because now there are celebrations going on. I have difficulties getting Grab to come to where I am, because I stay very near where they are doing the celebrations,
so it's quite
and it's a lot
okay.
this traffic jams and so on. Now, the celebrations aside, in terms of reform initiatives being successfully pushed through and so on, it's not there's not a lot to shout about. I think that's why BRCE gave them not a very high score here.
But personally, Doctor, what do you think of the Madani after, let's call it the midterm review, all right? Like the US is 2 years now. And how do you see in next general election, the coalition, maybe the configuration? Will it be maintained like this? Will they go as a coalition to the election? Or is it just like, okay, we're going on our own. Who wins? We form a coalition again. Do you think that would be the case?
Well, now, to answer the first part of your question, I think midterm review. I don't know what's actually what does D correspond to in terms of scores, right? But I will give them, let's say, about 70 points out of 100, because even though the Pakatan Harapan is supposed to be driving the reform agenda, but the reality is. You have many other coalition partners, right? In order to form a ruling coalition, you have UMNO, for example, and UMNO has, well, shall we say, very politely say, very different political outlook than Pakatan Harapan. It's already a miracle that these two coalitions previously, really getting at each other, and now they could rather harmoniously come together to form a government. There are some noises from time to time from the lower downs, wannabes, politicians from either side attacking each other. But at least the senior leaders who should know better, they are not like attacking each other every day, right? In that sense, it's the ability to keep a, shall we say, rather stable ruling coalition, that is no mean feat. That is quite an achievement. So we have to give that to Anwar and to his coalition partners. Number two, this country, shall we say, again, if we talk about trends and so on, there's a conservative, there's a trend approaching to a more conservative outlook for the country, right? And a lot of these so-called reforms that Anwar and his PH are supposed to enact and so on, they sometimes will run against this sort of conservatism. And as seasoned politicians, winning votes, it's most important, right? So therefore, they slow down their reform, the pace of their reform a little bit, knowing that their core supporters who are really gung-ho about reforms, well, they have no choice. They still have to support PH because otherwise you'll be supporting the more conservative side, which is at least in their mind even worse, right? So in that sense, I think he is doing the best he could under, shall we say, trying circumstances. Then going forward, well, if the main characters within the ruling coalition, they are still in charge of their respective parties, for example, then yes, and assuming this the component, well, I wouldn't say component parties, the different parties in these ruling coalitions, they still win a lot of seats in the next general election, yes, then they are likely to once again come together as a coalition government. But if there are, let's say, leadership changes, let's say within UMNO, let's say Zahid Hamidi, for whatever reason, is no longer UMNO president. There's another UMNO president coming up, and he or she may be, shall we say, they may take a liking to PN instead of PH, right? No, then you could imagine UMNO, just as it did during what's his name, Muhyiddin's time, they could just as well sort of align themselves with Muhyiddin and with PAS and so on, right? So it really depends on, number one, who is in charge in all these different parties. Number two, of course, before you start negotiating, you need to win enough seats. If you win only 2 seats, yeah, that's important. But, let me talk to the 10 seat holders first, right? So, yeah.
So, I mean, in a way, it doesn't change the fact that the opposition still is an attractive prospect for a diminished UMNO as it is.
Yeah.
But let's try go to other considerations within this Madani government, because Sabah and Sarawak is also part of this unity government framework. So in recent years, right, Sabah has been compared many times to Sarawak, with the latter being perceived as light years ahead in terms of development and political leadership. So what is your assessment on the inroads made by Sarawak and its nascent potential vis-a-vis Sabah, and what does that spell for the current dynamics within the unity government?
Well, I look at Sarawak, I think in a similar streak as I look at Donald Trump, namely, in a sense, very inward looking, right? What's in there for America, and relatedly, what's in there for Sarawak, right? So if you look at Donald Trump, what's good for America, he will probably adopt, he will probably, let's say internationally, he will probably join, right? So the same with Sarawak. Sarawak now is part of this ruling coalition. Let us not forget, after the general election 2 years ago, their first choice was not PH, it was PN, right? It's only when they saw the wind sort of not blowing in a certain direction, then they quickly changed their affiliation to be with PH. So if Sarawak continues to be, in my humble opinion, inward-looking, and I have plenty of Sarawak friends, so I hate to say this, shall we say self-centered, Sarawak-centered. I think I'm already using a very neutral term here, right? Centered, right? Then you never know. If they can get a good deal in terms of devolution of powers and money back and down to Sarawak, then they might continue to stay with this coalition. If not, they might as well, go back to their old friends. After all, they were also part of the Muhyiddin coalition, right? So it really depends. I mean, I'm being brutal about it in terms of the political game here. Now, our home state, our wonderful home state of Sabah, that's really wow west. And even though a lot of us are now in KL, and we are talking about the really crux of the Malaysian politics, but still in our home state, it's still very much wild west in the sense that. Well, number one, politics is very personality centric, right? If you are a politician worth your salt, you are probably not going to stay within a party where you have a party boss. You are going to go out there and have your own party, right? Even if that party would have maybe only yourself as the member of parliament or state assembly, still I want to have my own party. That's why you see a lot of these different parties going on in Sabah, each having a few seats. Let us be generous about it. So I think after the next Sabah general election, this sort of phenomenon I think is still going to persist. Namely, different parties would win a number of seats each, ranging from 1 to, let's say, 10, and let me be even more generous, 15. I think that's the most already. That's really stretching already, 15. And therefore, in order to form a ruling coalition in the state of Sabah, you would still need to have all these negotiations, right? To form coalitions, party A and C instead of A and B, but sometimes B may go to D, and then there's this tiny party with one seat, they join the B and D setup and not the A and C setup, and so on.
Yeah.
So you still see all these negotiations going on after the results sort of drip in after at the night of the voting. So let's see what happens and who would be the next Sabah chief minister.
All right, you already mentioned about Sabah election. Let's go into the most juiciest news coming from Sabah this month, which is the Graf scandal. The video was leaked by Malaysia-China and whatnot. What are the political implications of this to Madani, especially the Madani government? Because, of course, GRS is with Madani government. And what your prediction again with the configurations in Sabah? Because PKR Sabah would use this as an excuse to not ally with GRS, but maybe, let's say, to Warisan.
Yeah.
They did it before. Would they do it again?
Well, if you listen to the coffee shop talks in Sabah,
We call ourselves Kopitiam.
then people get to be very cynical, right? It's say what's new, as if that's news for Sabah, with the implication that such shall we say corruption and collusions have always been ongoing within the Sabah political, or shall we say, socio-political context. So it's not something which is extremely shocking to those of us who are Sabahans. We knew that these are ongoing. It's just that, well, it happens to be a so-called review. Number two, would it have a lot of political impact? Probably within the urban populations. And the urban voters are a little bit confused because last time it was clearer, right? You vote for PH, you're voting for change. Otherwise, you're not voting for change. Now, PH is government, and then some other parties claim themselves to be advocating change. So it's very confused. You really don't know who or which party you should support for the urban voters, and thereby such political scandal, shall we say, might have some bearing on their mind. But if you are, frankly speaking, talking about the rural, or shall we say, the more remotely settled voters, is still what is euphemistically called development politics, namely whether, when it comes election time, their resources, quote unquote, been distributed to my village, or to me personally, and that really counts during elections for the rural seats in Sabah. Now, if you are talking about political configurations, for example, whether PH or let's say PKI in particular, how they are going to align themselves in view of these latest revelations and so on, I think PKR has a lot of homework to do first. Number one, as I said, you need to be, I mean, as a party, you need to be prominent yourselves before you can talk about I'm aligning with A or B, right? So you need to have a lot of house cleaning to do. For example, I used to know that it was Dr. Jeffrey Kitingan who was PKR chief at some point, and then Ansari Abdullah, and then my friend Christina Liu. Frankly speaking, I don't know who is the PKR chief now. I simply don't know. I'm sorry, I'm a political commentator. I might not have done my homework enough. So you need to groom people within your own party who are a bit prominent. You need to, as a party, do some groundworks, organization works to make your party. I mean, if there's another party, for example, this Peter Anthony party. I can't even remember what's the name of the party, but immediately I remember Peter Anthony and his friends.
The character himself is the prominent, not the party.
KDM, I think it's called, yeah. And then he has his friends, right? And they have won a number of seats, not a few, quite a number, right? I mean, how about you, PKR? I mean, I know Christina has a seat. I can't even remember who else has a seat in PKR. So you first need to clean up yourselves. I don't know how we are going to do it. I mean, after all, if federally you are the ruling party, right? You're driving the nation's agenda. But how come in Sabah you are like... I mean, nothing is too much to say, but I mean, you are like, not so prominent, shall we say. First, you must make yourself politically relevant and prominent. Then you can talk about, I want Shafi, I want Hajiji, and so on. I think first they need to do that.
I think that's the irony, because oftentimes the Prime Minister has visited Sabah in the capacity of PKR president to try bolster the morale there. But of course, that leads to some criticism that he's putting in favor instead of his partners. But a second thing I want to go back to when it comes to this whole clientelism, patronage politics, right? As more of a feature in Sabah, because the relationship between the politician and the communities is so intertwined with the idea of patronage that me and Hafiz had this discussion before, that politicians have no choice but to engage in such activities that were deemed corrupted. So that would be making the assumption that it's very hard to decouple from our political scene. But what would you think in terms of...
I sort of moderated my view a little bit on this. I used to think many politicians are very evil, they're very corrupt and so on. They collude with businessmen, to enrich themselves. I still think that's true to a large extent. But also sometimes that's by necessity. Because I've been traveling around, for work, attending conferences and so on in many other developing countries. That's why international affairs, sometimes if you look at it from that angle and you look at your own domestic politics, it gives you perhaps a better understanding. I've been to countries in Africa, especially to Ghana, to Rwanda, and to Tanzania, and so on. And recently I went to a country which is sort of, I think, bordering between developing and developed. That is Cyprus. And as I look at the politics in these countries, they are not very different from what's going on here, because they are, by definition, developing countries, right? Therefore, there are, shall we say, a lot of poor people. And when people are poor, then and it's let's say it's a democratic country with votings and so on. Then of course, you would expect people you vote into office would improve your lives, right? in the more developed countries, you can say, politicians, yeah, they should improve your lives, but in a general way that gives you better infrastructure, then you can work better and so on. But in developing countries, people don't look at it that way. I voted for you as my representative, and thereby you must benefit me personally and my family. You must either give me cash outright or at least some sort of material assistance, right? And for politicians to succeed in this sort of environment, you need to hand out cash. This is I'm not even talking about vote buying. It's simply your voters coming to you and say, I need cash, otherwise I cannot survive, right? I mean, even if you're ministers and even you're cleaners of the cleaners, how are you going to give out all this cash, right? I mean, you can say, use government resources. There's also very limited government resources, right? So, sometimes you would need to you need to say, okay, sorry, I don't have that kind of cash, but my friend businessman one, he could probably give you a job or something like that. Then businessman one and you probably will have some kind of arrangement. He will get some projects in order for him to create those jobs, right? Yeah. So I'm not trying at all to justify this sort of what I would call collusion. Perhaps not exactly corruption, but collusion, right? But that's reality in not only Malaysia, not only Sabah, but in Kenya, in Ghana, in Rwanda, and so on. So it's a very common phenomenon in developing countries until such day as our general income level, goes up and we become sort of a developed country. Then perhaps this kind of phenomenon will lessen a little bit. Yeah.
Just want to bring you back, Doctor, again to Sarawak, because recently Sarawak has been in courts with Petronas.
Yes.
A lot of times and whatnot. And then we can foresee that if Petronas win this battle, it's just going to be business as usual. But I think if Sarawak wins, it will open a new precedent for other states like Sabah, Kelantan, and Terengganu as well. So do you think Sabah, especially Sabah, will follow suit if Sarawak win this?
Well, I think we in Sabah have to be more proactive in terms of so-called pursuing our rights and privileges under the Malaysia Agreement 1963, right? Sarawak, it's always in the limelight for very aggressively pursuing such rights and privileges and benefits. In Sabah, it seems like only some very public-minded NGOs pursuing that, and even bringing suits and so on. So I think the least that the state government could do is to, number one, not object to such suits, and number two, perhaps provide some assistance, legal assistance. Our friend Keith, what's his name? Keith Saw, right? Yeah. Perhaps should be more proactive in doing so, and if circumstances are appropriate, the state government could emulate the Sarawak state government and pursue similar suits. Because if you have two suits coming together, then it's stronger, the case, right? And who knows, Kelantan and Terengganu, those are opposition states. They may join you, right? And don't forget Johor, right? Now, and if this sort of, shall we say, entanglements with the federal government, if somehow the results are more in favor of the states, right, then I think it's a very good development, because then we are truly seeing a devolution of the national powers to the various states. I'm always very uncomfortable when I see too much power being concentrated or centralized, right? I like the sort of American arrangements where the states still hold a lot of rights. So you see, I'm not even talking about Sabah and Sarawak being special. I'm just talking about in general.
The idea of federalism.
Yeah, that we should have better practices in federalism.
Yeah, so that goes back to, I think, one of the strengths in Sarawak. Maybe you could disagree or agree with me that Sarawak doesn't necessarily use MA63. They tend to look at what's on an ad hoc basis or their personal grievances, and they articulate for that. Whereas Sabah, we're still meandering in the idea of MA63. So I remember I posed this question to Dr. Madani back in 2019. I says, "It is time for a new arrangement." And his reply back to me was, "Are your leaders ready for a new arrangement?" So, what will we
I
make
think,
of this?
well, Dr. Mahathir's retorts to you that are your leaders ready for it? I think it's really a very pertinent. He has looked at politics for many, many years, right? He sort of knows the calibers of leaders everywhere, both domestically and internationally, right? In that sense, I'm not disagreeing with him at all. And also, there's another related point, namely, you see, even if you get back all these rights and privileges, would you make good use of them, right? I don't know. I'm saying because just now we were discussing about the rampant and the endemic corruption and collusion that's going on in Sabah. Imagine with more money pumping into this mess, this cesspool. This swamp. This. I don't want to drain the swamp. This pool of a lot of big fishes and so on. What will happen to those fish feeds?
What do you think about the Sabah new framework, the blue economy? Do you think this is just another thing that they ought to do and then just never act on it? Or do you see a true potential in there?
Well, potential is always there, right? I think, for example, we are talking about using wave to generate electricity, energy, and so on. And of course, Sabah, as all of us experience, has a lot of brownouts and blackouts, right? We need to have more stable electricity supply. So if we can really harness the potentials and the powers of the ocean and the sea in terms of number one, energy, number two, to be self-reliant, self-sufficient in terms of food supply and so on. Yeah, well, why not? But we perhaps would need a more comprehensive I wouldn't say planning because I have problems with centralized planning, but I mean some sort of incentives perhaps, right? Some sort of incentives, for people to explore the potentials of the ocean and the sea for the purpose of, at least these two come to my mind. Number one, energy, and number two, food, right? But, sometimes in Malaysia in general, in Sabah in particular, when you talk about incentives and so on, immediately we are thinking about projects. Who gets those incentives? The related persons, right? and so on. Yeah. So that's where the cynicism would seep in, would come in. Yeah.
Yeah, so back to that cynicism, right? I think we had this conversation years ago in Clubhouse. Is that we should be a bit more kinder to ourselves because we've embarked on this democratic experiment only in the last 60 years, and Sabah itself is also relatively new, young as a polity, right? So, I mean, can you say that we are just growing pains rather than really we're just falling into obscurity?
Well, of course, recently I visited Cyprus, right? Cyprus got its independence in 1960. So it's actually halfway between 1957 formulation of Malaya and 1963 formulation of Malaysia, right? And Cyprus immediately descended into civil wars to the extent that nowadays they are cut in half essentially with the north and the south and so on. Whereas we in Malaysia, after all these years, we are still relatively peaceful despite some communal differences and so on. We totally don't have any meaningful kind of violence. Civil violence going on. So yeah, we could sort of pat our shoulders, congratulate ourselves on that. And but as a nation, of course, we strive for better, right? We try to be Singapore, we try to be Korea, we try to be Japan, look east again. And if you look at it from that perspective, of course, we could do much better. And of course, one key is education. Or nowadays we talk about educational reform and so on. Yeah.
Okay, Doctor. Last question before Adil asks his last question. We cannot let you go before we asking you about Singapore.
Okay.
All right. What do you think about Lawrence Wong as the new Prime Minister? Would he ship Singapore differently, or do you think it's just going to maintain whatever Singapore has been doing in relation with Malaysia?
Well, at the risk of losing my Singapore affiliation, I can only say I hope the Singapore that it's under Lawrence Wong's guidance would be a kinder, gentler Singapore. A more people-centric Singapore. It's already very people-centric, but of course Singapore has its challenges in terms of the differences between the very rich and the more hard to do. So he I think has to resolve all this before everything else if he were to win resoundingly in the next general election. Yeah.
Okay, we've jumped all over the place, to be honest. Like, international, local, and then Sabah itself. Then somehow Singapore is here. So we also want to try and end this on a lighter note, Doctor. So we're going to go very off tangent and go back to asking personal things about you, if that's okay. The first question would be like, you've traveled extensively around the world.
Yeah.
What is your favorite holiday destination?
I would say Japan, because it's very predictable, right? Everything it's very well set out and so on. So you can, even though you don't know the language, you can probably go around Japan feeling safe, feeling that you could sort of orient yourselves everything. And as I said recently, I went to Cyprus. I think as a holiday destination, it's quite nice. I think Sabah has a lot to learn from Cyprus. For example, there's this small coastal town called Paphos with only 50,000 inhabitants, but it's one of the major tourism destinations for many Europeans. So I was thinking, Paphos sounds like Belfort. I say, if Paphos can, how come Belfort cannot? I was really thinking about that. I was discussing with my wife to the extent he's telling you, are you crazy or what? So let's say Belfort could learn a lot from Paphos, for example. You see, everything I would internalize it and try to look at them in terms of international affairs and politics.
Yeah. But surely there's a spillover from Greece, right?
Of course. The southern part of Cyprus, it's mainly Greek, and the northern part mainly Turks and so on. And sometimes they are more affiliated with Turkey and with Greece more than anything else. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So another personal question is, you travel, obviously, you imagine particular images or particular sensations when you travel. For me personally, is music. So on that note, what's your favorite type of music, Doctor?
Well, there's opera music, which I like a lot. All the Pavarottis and Jose Carreras and Placido Domingos and so on. That's one part of it. That's mainly because my father liked it, and I sort of inherited that. I even inherited a lot of those cassettes and so on from him. But I also like musics from the late 1960s to, let's say, throughout the 1970s. The Bonnie M's, the Bee Gees, and so on. I think they encapsulate a very colorful and very vibrant decade.
So I assume when it comes to, because I know you can speak German, right? Doctor?
Yeah, a little bit.
Wagner would be no issue.
Wagner, those are, shall we say, the last bit of classical music. And of course, German operas has Wagner's influence as well. Yeah.
Okay. How about your French Is it still?
I could probably order food in a French restaurant and ask for how much is the price and so on. Mainly because I used to work in Geneva in Switzerland, and it's a French-speaking part of Switzerland. I did not, I think, properly learn French academically, but you need to survive, right? So you need to pick up so-called street French and so on. Yeah.
Okay, I think that is all the time we have with our guest, Dr. Oesun, who furnished us with a lot of things that I hope that you as the viewers will take away when it comes to considering not just domestic affairs, but international affairs as well, and how it interplays with nearly everything surrounding us. So before we leave off, Hafiz, do you have anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
Before we wrap up, I would like to urge everyone to subscribe, because a lot of our viewers are not subscribers. So I think around about 70% are not subscribers. So if you like the content that being put out by Dr. O here right now, and you want more of Dr. O in the coming future, is that okay, right, Doctor?
Yes, of
so
course.
Definitely. So comment down below, I want more of Dr. O, and then we will bring him back on this episode. And if you like any of this content in shorter format, Adi, 60 seconds, less than that, you should go to our TikTok and our Instagram. Tons there.
Yeah, with that said, thank you everyone, and goodbye for now.